Hi everybody, good afternoon. Welcome to 407. Every Friday I come out and I'm like, oh, today's going to be awesome. And we have a really great lecturer because, well, it's a nice thing to do and say before our lecturer comes out. But today I really feel that way because I've seen this presentation. So even if you don't think the lecture part is awesome, I'm quite confident that you will think the presentation is, because it may very well get me fired, as you'll see from the first part. So stick around, the presentation is going to be awesome. But just a couple of minutes about the speaker. Leslie Grandy was asked to come here today. I've known Leslie for probably over 15 years. And when I met Leslie, we worked together at a startup that was very successful. But the bulk of Leslie's career has been as an entrepreneur in large companies such as T-Mobile, Apple, and Discovery Communications, among others. Leslie has been charged many times with coming up with new product markets, new product development, and business development to innovate within these larger companies. So as we've talked about in the past, many of you won't leave school and join a startup or create your own startup, but you might be part of an entity that's going to have an expectation that you know how to innovate as well. Leslie does that better than anybody I know, so please let's give her a warm welcome and a round of applause for Leslie Grandy.
Hey everyone, thanks for being here today. I'm very excited to be here, although I have to say it's been scary posting on my Facebook page because I'm a Northwestern grad, so you know, I do have to say, so I've gotten a couple of jabs, but fortunately I have a lot of friends who went to Ann Arbor, so they've been very supportive. What we're going to talk about today is the path to building products that matter, and why they matter is they matter both to customers, but they matter to companies because customers want them and are willing to pay for them. Having a great product isn't the only thing you need to do to build a great company. You need to understand your customers and you need to be able to deliver the product your customers want to pay for. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey, but less about me personally and more about how through the steps of customer development, I've managed to learn a lot about product development, and I hope to teach you some of those things as well. The most important thing to know is back in the day when I started, there was, I know this is going to make me seem like older than your parents, but there was no internet to sell product. And when you had to make technology product for computers, you had to actually think it through in a way that would package it up into a box, put shrink wrap on it, and get it on a shelf at a store like CompUSA, which doesn't even exist anymore. But in that world, you had 18 months, and you could think through the process of building products in a very linear fashion. You have an idea, you go through the product development process, you take it to market, you test. And then when you test, you get some feedback and you fix some bugs, but then you're ready to launch because you know you have a product the market wants and you need to get it on the shelf in order to get it to customers. That was the old way of doing it, but the internet kind of changed everything, partly because the internet introduced, obviously, real-time development where you can produce products and put them online and get customers in near real time, right? The minute you put it up there, it can be available for someone to download. So businesses have had to respond, and the way they've had to respond is by becoming more lean and more agile, and I'm sure a number of you have heard about the agile startup process. So I'm going to show you the difference, whoops, that went right past, the difference between the two, because waterfall, as I said, very linear. You pick something, you go after it, you know you're right, you put it on the market, and people buy it. But in lean, it's an iterative process. It's really working with your customers and synchronizing your customer development process to your product development process. So we're going to play a little video here, which hopefully doesn't get Tom fired, but explains what I'm talking about.
So you have a startup?
Yes, I guess so.
Is it lean? I'm a lean startup ninja. I know lean startup jujitsu. I can help you iterate. Are you iterating? What does your startup do? You have to iterate.
Well, I guess you could say I'm in pharmaceuticals.
Are you iterating? Do you practice customer development? You have to get out of the building in order to iterate. Are you out of the building?
My startup sells crack cocaine to junkies. So yeah, I'm out of the building a lot.
What is your market type theory? Are you creating a new market? Are you bringing product to an existing market? Are you resegmenting? Make sure you are iterating.
My market is junkies who cannot survive more than 6 hours without my product or their brains implode. They will beg, borrow, steal, and kill to come up with $10 so to buy a rock. I give the people who are not already addicted a free sample, and then they are instantly addicted, and they end up giving me everything they own plus everything they can steal from their parents, siblings, kids, and friends. I don't need to iterate.
Everyone has to iterate. You have to spend time in the mind set of learning and iterating before you launch, otherwise you will never take your startup through the 4 stages of customer discovery, customer validation, customer creation, and company building, when you can finally cross the chasm.
I earn 60% gross margin on every sale and my marketing costs are 0.
You still have to iterate.
My customers find me wherever I set up shop. I could be in a coal mine, and those damn junkies would still find me to buy my product.
Iteration is everything. You must iterate. You will never assess your assumptions about the market and develop your minimal viable product.
Look, my minimal viable product is pure powdered cocaine boiled with ammonia and baking soda and rocked up into pieces that cost 10 times more per gram than 24-karat gold.
Are you practicing continuous deployment? You will never achieve lean startup iteration mojo without continuous deployment.
I sell through my batches almost immediately and then move to a different location to avoid arrest. I deploy several times a day, especially on payday.
I don't think you are iterating enough. You have to iterate. You are still practicing waterfall. If you want to be a lean startup ninja pirate rock star like me, you have to employ continuous agile scrum customer development iteration to drive market development. I bet you don't even track your backlog.
I have no idea what the you are talking about. How much of my product have you been smoking? Junkies.
So the purpose of that video is actually to show there are very few circumstances anymore where waterfall development really does make sense. And those are circumstances where the market is pretty perfect, where you know the customer, they're willing to pay any amount of money to get it. And quite frankly, the irony of it is pharmaceuticals really are that, right? If you have a cure for cancer, I'll pay anything for it if I have someone who I love is suffering from cancer, right? So the market is perfect. And you don't have to think about iterating when you have that level of control of both your customer and your price point. But who does that anymore, right? That's not the way business really works. You have to be able to adapt to the changing market forces and the changing needs of your customers. So as we talk about customer discovery, we really talk about the fact that before you start building, you need to validate your hypothesis. You really need to understand the things that are driving the customer's needs. The need state you'll hear a lot in product development is the early going where you take that fuzzy front end of an idea and you start to productize it into something commercial. But you don't do it by telling the customer what it is you want. You do it by listening. And this is another great example. If you've all seen the show Silicon Valley, right? I think you may need to play that one too.
Hi. I'd like to talk to you about a company called Pied Piper. What does it do? Good question. Maybe you can help us find an answer. What if Pied Piper was an app that could attract rodents? You know, like the fairy tale for purposes of extermination or to feed your pet snake. We're not here to tell you what to do with your rats. We're here to get you rats stat. Would you be very interested, somewhat interested, or not interested? Which one? Which one? Which one? You've heard the phrase, time to pay the piper, right? What if there was an app called Pied Piper that could tell you to a statistical degree of certainty whether you were going to heaven or hell? Very interested, somewhat interested, not interested. Which one? Which one? Which one? How much would it be worth to you if I told you I had a GPS app called Pied Piper tracking the location of your child? I can follow your child anywhere, and there is nothing you can do to stop me. Most missing children are never found. Interested, very interested, or very interested.
Okay, so what's obviously wrong with that is somebody's coming up with a problem that nobody actually has, right? That's not the way that people really need to do discovery when they get out of the building, because if I tell you, here's what you want, are you interested? You might be, but will you ever pay for it? How do I know? Just because I asked you on the street doesn't tell me. So I'm going to tell you a little story about an experience that I had myself at T-Mobile and kind of engage you in this process of customer discovery with me. So when I was at T-Mobile, one of the ways that we wanted to differentiate ourselves as a carrier was to have products that were in the field of communication, but weren't the same as just everybody else's handsets. And if you understand the carrier market at all, you know that Samsung and everybody goes from carrier to carrier shopping handsets, and then you as a consumer has to figure out which is the place you want to go, and then you have to figure out which network is the one that's going to give you coverage. But that's really not the way that consumers get excited about products, right? They get excited about products that fill a need. And so we wanted to find communication products that might be that kind of a switching motivator for someone to come to T-Mobile that wasn't just because we had a cool new phone, because that's a short-lived trend. What was the innovation that we could create? So the area is communications, and we set out with the company IDEO to investigate with customers what needs we could fulfill. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and I'm going to tell you how we got there through this process. So how many of you share parents with grandparents, share pictures with grandparents? How many of you take your pictures and share your pictures with grandparents? All right. So when you do it, how do you do it? Tell me how you do it. Do you do it by email? Are they on Facebook?
I do it by phone.
So you send pictures to their phone?
Yes.
Do they know how to print them out?
No.
And what do they do with them after they're on their phone? Are they able to show them in their house?
Yes, they show them in their house.
But by showing their phone, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And then I have to teach them how to like open it and things like that.
Perfect. Anyone else? Does anybody else have a way that they share pictures? How do you share pictures with your parents or your grandparents?
I print them out and give it to them.
Oh, you have to do it as a printout. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. And you, what do you do? Do you share pictures with people not on your peer group and not people, people in your family that might want to see something?
Yeah, share it on Facebook.
You share on Facebook. And do they know how to print them off of Facebook or what to do with them off of Facebook?
Yeah.
Yeah, they do? Most of your parents? Okay, great. So now we have 3 different customers. Did you hear that? 3 different people with 3 different problem sets around photos, right? So each one of them has a way that they deal with it, but they're not all the same, right? So there's a challenge in gathering data in a raw manner where people can say, oh, this is what I do, or this is what my friends do, but it's not always the same thing, right? Your family is much more digitally savvy than it seems like your family may be, right? So in that scenario, where does that leave us? When we're inventing products, we look at those different customer types, right? We look at them and we look at their need states and the way they talk about the problems that they have. And by looking at each one of those customers, we start to gather up data points. And when you graph those need states, you start to see these wave diagrams that are at the bottom. And when you overlap each of the different customers' need states, you start to see your area of opportunity, right? The common need points, the things that people say the most. I have trouble getting it in a physical state, or I have trouble sharing it when it's on my phone to someone else if I don't have my phone. What we ended up developing was the first 3G-enabled digital picture frame, so that your grandparents could actually receive phone pictures to a phone that looks like a picture frame. It doesn't dial, it doesn't have voice. It literally, when they walked in the door, would have a new set of pictures. And the capacity for that problem-solving solution came from the fact that digital picture frames existed, but nobody knew how to use the memory card. So I always had the same 20 pictures. Every house we walked into, that was the biggest complaint. Every place we visited, we saw these digital picture frames that had old pictures that never got changed out, because the people who had them, who were given them, say, I just don't know what to do until my grandson comes. I don't know how to change out the pictures. I don't know how to add pictures to it. It was a static picture frame that just happened to have a loop of pictures on it, as opposed to a living picture frame that was constantly getting updated and constantly getting added to by the grandparent from their phone just as easily as it was from the parent or from the child. And then there was a cloud service so that you could actually manage it for your grandparents. So all of the elements came together by looking at what were the common need states that we saw and what it was that people were looking for out of the experience of visual communication.
Leslie, how do you tell the difference between something that's a nice to have for that audience or something that they would be willing to pay for? I mean, how do you sort of break it down of, I'm good with just waiting till my grandchild shows up to change my pictures, because at least then I'll get a visit?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think what you see is the 2 things that happen here, and it's actually a really great question, because in this particular story, it was a great product that didn't have a great answer for this. Because selling a product like this for a carrier is really hard. They know how to sell phones, and they don't know how to sell products that don't have voice associated with them. And this was a product that didn't have voice associated with it. So we actually didn't know what the price sensitivity for a non-customer was because there was no way to actually sell it to a non-customer. So we never actually went through the process, and in some ways, it's the reason the product actually ultimately failed. You can't buy that product, even though people would still want it today, because there was no good way to sell it. And so that's a huge question in every new product innovation is, and it'll come up, and it's actually where in this process we failed, which is later in the customer creation process. Our capacity to actually sell that product killed that product, not the product. We sold out of everything that we could sell to our own customers. But the whole purpose of that product was to get people to come to T-Mobile, not to sell something to our existing customer base. So we actually failed on customer creation, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But it's a really critical point in understanding the value of new product development. So customer validation is that process that you always hear about where people talk about whether or not they're going to pivot. There was also a great clip in Silicon Valley about, we need to pivot. And that was what prompted all of that customer investigation. But really, the challenge for companies is they have a great idea, but they really have a hard time finding the customer for it, let alone finding the customer with money they'll part with. So the customer validation process really is trying to understand, if I put this product out on the market, will people adopt it? And if they adopt it, how will they adopt it? Because the business model I put around it has to go along with what I see as the behavioral model of my customers. How often do they use it? That's going to trigger how I should think about whether or not it's a recurring model or a transactional model. Is it something that people want to pay for, or is it something that they expect from a certain deliverable or a platform? Is it really a feature, or is it a product? And a great example of this is I'm currently on the board of directors of a startup in Seattle called Zantler, which makes a product called ShopPost. 4 years ago, I left Seattle to go work at Discovery in New York, and that company 4 years ago was called DIY Media, not Zantler. It was a completely different business in that it sold digital goods for independent artists and musicians. So something happened in those intervening 4 years that made them change their business. And what it was the customer validation cycle.
And they sold digital goods for artists and musicians.
Right, so they created an e-commerce platform that allowed them to package up a digital download and a physical good.
Got it.
For an independent artist. So if you were a local group with a band that sold t-shirts to also fund yourself, but you also wanted to sell digital downloads, they would power your site.
Got it.
They would power your site, and they would handle the fulfillment as well as the transaction for you. But it turned out there was no place to grow that business because most of the people who already had commerce didn't want to take on a platform that was a different way of handling transactions. It was actually more overhead than possible for them as a small independent to handle. So what they had to pivot was in understanding their customer. The customer was actually looking for the service, but not necessarily the e-commerce platform. So handling the transaction was commoditized. It was what you did with that content to promote it and to sell online that was really their secret sauce. So in those 3 years, they jettisoned out the e-commerce and fulfillment component of the business and amplified up their e-commerce integration with other e-commerce platforms, and today provide a social commerce tool for Amazon, Etsy, Shopify, and big commerce merchants to actually push out their own content into Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, Pinterest, and create little pop-up shops on all of those social platforms. So the same front-end technology that was going to the consumer is what was in their product before, but they spent so much of their development time previously on the e-commerce transactional side, which was never really that competitive. So to validate this process, they recognized that the customers they wanted were the ones who weren't going to buy because the actual meat of the product wasn't where they put most of their development effort. And so the pivot was to pivot towards providing a solution that was ancillary to e-commerce, not in and of itself creating e-commerce. A big change. And in that process, when you go through this customer development, you take all of that insight back into the product development process, and that's where the iteration comes, right? Because in customer validation, you're actually putting a product out there, having people use it, trying to see if you can find more people like that, and understanding what the hurdles are. And if those are technical hurdles, they come back into the extreme programming version of Agile, and they're able to actually reprioritize the feature set, which is what we do with Zantler now today. We have our business, we're very well established, we do know that we have these customers that are doing it, but the more customer types we get, the more we recognize that we have choices. So if we want enterprise customers, then we need to think about additional social media platform and analytics tools that we need to support. If we want to go for the small business person, we maybe need to come up with a different set of transactions for local offers. So it's enabled us to have a virtuous cycle to validate customers, and we exit this cycle when we have the repeatable process, when we know that a marketing person knows where to find that customer, and the customer who sees that message knows what to do with it. And when we see that on a consistent basis and people are willing to pay money for it, we understand that we can exit the customer validation cycle.
Okay, wait. That slide seems really intense and hard to me because I'm not an engineer. So if you had to dumb it down in terms of when do I need to start considering a pivot, when would that be? When no one's buying, when no one's...
When you can't exit, when this becomes your entire cycle, when all you're doing is continuing to adjust your product to find a customer, you probably are not in a business.
How long do you hang in there on something like that?
Well, part of it is a little bit of an IQ test. If you hear more than a few people saying the same things over and over again, you have to question whether there's actually a market or whether your product has hit a need, right?
What if you think you're so new and so cool that it would be impossible for people to validate it because what I'm doing is just so mind-blowing that there's no way for them to understand it?
So that to the earlier point in the lean startup, you can't cross that chasm to get mainstream until you get over that hurdle. So your iteration can go on as long as your money can go on, right? Your burn rate, if anything, is going to be the biggest dictator of how long you can iterate. And many investors get tired after years of continuous pivot and iteration in really saying this isn't a business, right? You can't settle on a market and you can't find a price point and you don't have a stable product. So it's not a business.
Can you think of one of the worst pivots you've ever been involved in as an example of bad pivot versus good pivot?
Well,
you can pick on one when you were working for me if you want. I can tell from the look on your face. You can go for it.
I'm tending to suggest that Tom and I worked at a time where we made a very good pivot, I would say, for the company, but we made it for reasons that didn't support the pivot long term. Right? I think that the idea is that the company was a product company and the pivot was to become a services company. And this is Real Networks that we're talking about. And mostly when I started and Tom started, we were a product company that made Real Player. And that was the development driver of the business. But then content became the development driver of the business, and we were in a video subscription business. And that pivot was very important for the company. But it was a little bit ahead of its time in terms of it was pre-Hulu and pre-Netflix, so really the customer usage patterns weren't well ingrained. There was a challenge around pricing because the only comparable price point was cable subscription services. You didn't have a Hulu or a Netflix subscription even on the DVD side of Netflix at that time to think about that. And probably our only other real competition was the emergence of TiVo at the time, in terms of changing customer viewing patterns for video and how people were watching asynchronously from linear television. So it was a good pivot for the company, but it was probably a bad pivot from a timing standpoint. We were not the company to be the leader in that pack for other reasons that had nothing to do with the idea of the service offering. But being ahead of its time, we weren't able to really nail on this process, and ended up iterating through it so many times that ultimately our partners who were involved in it got tired of participating, right? So that's another reason you end up falling is your investors or your partners just don't have the patience anymore. It's a fabulous question.
Can you repeat the question, sir?
Yeah, I'm sorry. The question was, how do you gauge customer satisfaction when mostly it's your unhappy customers you hear the most from? it's such a rich question because there's a couple different ways to think about that answer. The first is definitely the squeaky wheels give you a lot of information, but it's a question of what percentage of your population do they represent, right? So that's the first piece you look at when you do it. The second thing you look at really is behavioral data supporting it? What can I see in the product metrics that help me understand others are suffering who aren't complaining, or this is a very unique set of usage behaviors that are creating that environment for that person to be unhappy? I got really good at this at Real Networks because you had people who were very vocal, because when you want to watch your program and it's not available, you get really pissed off. And you get really pissed off, especially if it's during the 9/11 era and you're trying to get important news, which is what it was. And so we would get very hostile customers who would be very unhappy, as Tom would tell you, because they couldn't find the play button on the player, all right? Because they just wanted to watch it, and why are you making this so hard? In that scenario, because we mostly got complaints, we stopped talking to customers, actually, because we knew they were unhappy. But we knew they were unhappy because the easiest way is we were in a subscription business and they didn't renew. Right? That's the best part about customer satisfaction when you run a service business is people stop paying you when they don't need it anymore. It's not the I bought this product home and it fell apart and I complain, but every time I want to use it, it irritates me. Every time I stopped using it. So usage data is probably your best gauge of customer satisfaction. Are people using it a lot? Under what circumstances are they using it? Are they using it out of obligation or choice? And a lot of your metrics, if you're really good in building products to be data-driven, can tell you whether your customers are happy or using it as you intended them to. So that's the most important part, is sometimes that's where your pivot comes from, actually, is finding they're unhappy because they're trying to make your product be something it isn't. But if you only made a couple of adjustments, you'd actually have more happy customers and a larger market share. So looking at that data and investigating why they're unhappy, is it bugs? Is it mismarketing? I thought it was something, but it's really something else. And that actually will come up in the next part of customer creation, which is really optimizing that demand gen, knowing you're getting the right customers, the people who want the product the way it is, and the people who are happy to pay for it as it is, and the people who believe you will stand by it if they commit to using it. And that credibility and community and brand around your product really is the tool for building the customer business, because understanding how people want to acquire your product, how they want to use it, how often, times of day. And going back to that graph I showed you about our customer data, that was data that was from when I was at Discovery, and what we want to understand is what do people do before they see a show, during a show, and after a show. Because that's going to tell us how they're going to consume the rest of what we have to offer them online. So we look at understanding the customer journey in customer creation and figuring out what are our points of leverage to acquire more customers, either through evangelists of our product or through direct marketing channels.
The new redesigned Vuza is beautiful. We did a complete overhaul on the back end, and on the front end, it's this gorgeous yet minimalist makeover.
Oh, it's riddled with technical failures and glitches. Users think it's a disaster.
As with any significant product change, there's varied reactions, particularly in the beginning.
Thousands of furious users, serious technical problems. It's slow, it ignores clicks, and when the user hits save, it deletes their whole hard drive.
We're actively measuring user feedback so we can continuously make improvements.
Look at these emails. I feel molested by Vuza. Nobody in their right mind would remove that feature. It's as if Vuza kidnapped my family and threw him off a hot air balloon.
We deeply value how much our users care about Vuza, and we recognize that this is a lot of change, so we're listening to all the feedback in the community.
I've never seen a launch go this badly. We've had 9,000 bug reports. It takes 7 months to open up an attachment. If I invite a friend to join, it sends him a death threat, and if I copy-paste anything, it sends my credit card information to all of the federal prisoners.
Our innovation and design process will continue to be driven by our mission to delight users.
Fix it? Fix it? I don't know how to fix it!
Sure, we've had a few complaints, but it's actually in line with previous releases, and we've heard from many users that they're really enjoying the new experience.
They're a lynch mob. I'm getting death threats. That's my home. That's my address. How? I gotta get out of here. I'm leaving. I gotta protect my family!
Dude, can you just keep it down, man? You know this is my nap from 2 to 4 p.m.
So to that point, right, it's what are your users really complaining about, and is marketing understanding that they're attracting the right users, or is it the product, right? And this customer creation process depends on being in sync both with the customer and the product. So that center diagram that Tom said was a little complicated to just grasp as a flash is something that you guys should think about, because they're concurrent processes that when they don't synchronize, that's what happens. When they're synchronized and the customer development process aligns with the product development process, you actually get the opposite of that. You get customers who are willing to help you improve the product because they want it to be better. By and large, that's what happened to Apple, right? Everybody wants Apple products to be great and wants to give that feedback to make them even better. Because you love that product, you want to invest in making sure it's the best product it can be, as opposed to complaining about it. So I think the customer complaints are really an important question and a really great test of whether or not you're out of the validation and into the creation stage. So the last stage of this process is really building an environment and culture for employees that your customers will appreciate. And when I was at T-Mobile, one of the big things, it's hard to believe a carrier would care about customer service, but when we were differentiating ourselves as the 4th largest carrier, it was really on customer service. And if you look back in those years, it was always about the J.D. Power Awards that we had for customer service. And the way that we created that feeling for customers to believe they were important to us is we actually didn't even call our corporate office headquarters. It was a field service center. Everyone who worked at corporate worked on behalf of the people who in the field had to talk to our customers. Everyone in that company who was an executive had to work a week in a retail store and hear customer complaints and see how their systems in that store screwed up the transaction process or slowed down the capacity for a customer to get in and out of the store. You would walk into the store, and I was in product development, and so every single handset complaint for a week that came into that store was sent to me. Because every time I would hear how unhappy our customers are, I would see how it made it hard for the retail employee to make a living. And it would be so much more impactful for me to go back and solve that problem on behalf of both our customers and our employees if I thought of myself as a field service center employee, as opposed to an executive who dropped down from headquarters to look at the minions. And boy, did they always give us the hard jobs too. They loved doing that. Honest to God, I could not close out the cash register one night. There was always 2 pennies off. I don't know where those pennies, I think the guys were shoving pennies in the bottom of the drawer and pulling them out at the end. But it was an experience that you had to live in order to understand how to service customers and the culture of the company that we were trying to build. So how does your company's culture reflect in your customer interactions, right? Are you walking the talk that your marketing messages are when your customer actually acquires your product, opens it up, and has to see tons of instructions? Look at the difference in opening an IKEA box and opening an Apple box, right? There's a difference in terms of what that culture is, but you're okay with doing it in IKEA because you know when you go there, that's part of the experience, right? If your Apple product, though, came like your IKEA product, it would be pretty stunning, right? And if you called up Apple after spending what you spent to have that product and couldn't get a customer service rep on the phone to talk to you effectively, that would also be a little bit problematic. So what Apple did is they built retail stores so you don't have to call on the phone. You walk in and you see that person that's going to help you. Apple retail stores aren't all about retail. They're about customers, brands, and customer service, right? And making sure every single customer that owns an Apple product is a happy customer. And that really makes the difference when customers notice that, right? It makes the difference in how you want to support the people who are supporting you. It's how you tip people when they give you better service. It's why you do that repeat visit to somebody that you like as a small business owner. It's because they give you good service. It's so true in a startup, but it's the last thing people think about. And sometimes it's the most important thing because I don't want to be a customer of a business that doesn't appreciate my business. So it's the most important thing, and it's probably the thing that I see a lot of CEOs in startups spend the least amount of time on, and then you end up seeing this company of unhappy employees that makes products that are buggy and that waits 24 hours or over a weekend to respond to a customer complaint, and that changes the whole dynamic of the customer and the business future. So with that, I think
we're going to put you in the hot seat. First of all, thank you for an excellent lecture, Leslie. Why don't you take this seat?
It is a hot seat.
Well, this is actually the hot seat because I'm staring at this leg. No, I'll take it. No. If anybody's going to go down on their ass today, it'll be me.
Sorry.
So first of all, I guess before we get started, is there anybody in the audience that has a question based on what Leslie was talking about today? Wow. You were either really good or really awful.
I was going to say really boring, maybe.
There's one. Yes, sir.
So you're speaking about CEOs of startups nowadays not really spending it on Amazon.
Yeah, sure. There's actually a company in Seattle. I don't know how well known it is at your demographic because you're not homeowners, but it's a company called Porch. And it is a service-based business for home management. And it's actually like an Angie's List where you could go find service employees, handymen, cleanup crews, whatever. But instead of it being run more like a Yelp, it's actually run where the business is providing a service for both the vendor and the customer, and providing in that service a concierge to make sure that connection goes well, and handling the transaction on behalf of the customer so the customer feels secure with an unknown vendor. So in that scenario, both the vendor feels well protected and the customer feels super well protected because the transaction is with a company, not with the unknown handyman. And in this scenario, as they've evolved, it's all been about bringing innovation to customer service to a transaction that generally people do all the time, but don't do it very happily or it doesn't always work out well. We did a remodel, got a handyman from a Home Depot. When we complained about him, the Home Depot manager, all he could say was, I'll take him off my list. Right? There wasn't much he could do. In Porch, if I put that transaction in and I complain, Porch can escrow that transaction for me. Right? So it's improving in a shared economy a customer service experience and something that's very common and very typical, but adding an extra flair, I think, that the internet and real-time kind of transaction monitoring can do.
I think it's really tricky because, generally speaking, most investors in the venture world are not necessarily strongly encouraging you to make sure that you're loving your customers. They're encouraging you to grow your user base.
Totally.
So like last night they had the Crunchy Awards, which is the TechCrunch Awards, and I think Yik Yak won like hottest startup or something else. I don't really think that the Yik Yak management team spends a lot of time thinking about, I wonder how that person felt that they, the yak just got yak voted up because they, ended up sleeping in a bush last night. But if they start to see a drop off in usage, then you'll start to see people really pay attention to their customers. And what's interesting in startups, particularly those that are either app-based or viral, by the time they figure out that there is a customer problem, they're dead. It's like they're yesterday's news. There's a new app in that space that's getting the same sort of rapid adoption curve, and you will not recover it. I mean, MySpace never figured out that there was ever going to be anything as bad and cool and special as having your own MySpace page. And by the time they figured out they were dead, it was too late. Do you have a question, Tori?
Yeah, so you've worked at some big companies like T-Mobile and Apple and Discovery. Have you been on a lot of male-dominated teams, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's funny.
She had one boss that was so awesome.
Yeah, he was just awesome. I won't talk about him. It's funny you say that because I was raised with a lot of boys in my family, and I'm less sensitized to being around male humor. That being said, I am often amazed at how men are not sensitized to inappropriate remarks. In the most bizarre experience I had was I was the last one to walk into a meeting room. The meeting hadn't started. It was on time, but they made some comment about my haircut. And I just thought, wait, oh look, there's no other women here, and that came from a man, so I know it wasn't they were actually commenting about my haircut. Right? Because the way it was said. And I think, well, I could act or I could react, right? And I just say, yeah, thanks, right? Because at the moment that you play, it was exactly the way it was with my brothers, right? Give them something back, and it shows that it bothers you, then that's a weak link, right? To me, I've always operated as if I'm just one of the team, not one of the boys, not one of the girls, I'm one of the team. But I will say that I figured out later than I wish I had that other women who report into me saw me as more of a role model than I identified with. And so I think that sometimes you're figuring it out on your own and you don't realize there are other people watching you figure it out. And I think I became more aware of the fact that I should be sensitive to it, not because it bothered me as much as because I wanted to do the right thing by the people who I managed or who were looking up to me. So in that scenario, it's something I'm more attuned to, that yes, I am in a male-dominated scenario and I am likely to have less empathy in certain conversations. But at the same time, I don't want to be in reverse discriminating against a room full of men and assuming that they're going to be doing something that they aren't yet doing. So I try to give everybody the benefit of the doubt, but I'm much more sensitive than I think I ever was because of the number of women I've hired who have come and told me later that they appreciate my success, at which point I realized, oh my gosh, you were looking? I should pay attention more. And so I think that's the real obligation, is after a certain stature as a manager, you recognize you should pay attention to the way that you handle yourself in those scenarios. But I would honestly say, with the career that I have, I would be lying if I said I'd really reached any discrimination. I don't feel, at the end of the day, businesses or companies want to hire people who aren't performing. They want to hire people who perform, and if that's a woman or a man, that's what they want, right? So focusing more on performance has always been my goal, and I think that's the advice I would give others.
Oh, you gals and your sassy answers. I'm just kidding. I was kidding, Leslie.
That wasn't even my sassiest.
Of all the products that you've worked on, have you ever been forced into a situation where you knew one was a stinker? And how did you deal with or mitigate the damage or extricate yourself or alert management that it was a stinker in a way that didn't have the stink come back to you?
That's so funny, because that's like my interview question.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
I actually interview product people with that question. Because it's funny, the reason I do is because when I interviewed at Apple, I was interviewed by Steve Jobs, and the question I was asked was, how does it feel to be the product manager of crappy products? Because he hated Real Networks products so much. And I thought, this is such a great interview question, I'm going to use it again, but in a less obnoxious way. But the answer I give is nobody sets out that way. Products often become crappy for other reasons than knowing they're going to be a crappy idea. So, I think in many cases the crappy products I've worked on have become crappy because of committee-based decision making, because of rush to market pressures that don't allow the product to hit the right customer or the right time in the market. Products become shitty because people can't say no. Everybody gets enamored with something in the product, and it's not the thing, but it's something they have to have in the product. So then it becomes sort of a ransom note product where the consumer looks at it and sees all of those like seams and doesn't know which thing it was really meant to be. Those are when products become crappy. So mostly my experience has been to try to remove crappiness, right, in that process, and to simplify down. And the best example that I would actually say is we all thought the first Google phone was going to be the crappiest phone in the world, because Google really has a lot of great technical power, but not a lot of great brand and customer experience, and certainly had no empathy for a carrier who had to sell it. And so we all sort of struggled with that product as it was coming to market to keep it from being crappy. Right? And the crappy factor was every day fighting about, does this stay in and does this stay out? And in aggregate, what we have left, is it crap or is it meaningful? And so I think that tends to be the more common scenario, is not extricating yourself out of something that you see as a train wreck going on, that's about to go on, but seeing the train wreck you're headed for and trying to keep it from being a train wreck.
So as one follow-on, and then I'm going to turn it back to Tori, in all of your product marketing bag of tricks, what's your Hail Mary that you go to when nothing else seems to be working? From a marketing perspective? Yeah. PR. PR is the easiest way for somebody else to tell the business that I want to change something. Because if I'm really good at going out to the press and going out and talking to the influencer community, and those are the people that businesses most likely will listen to before the last
stamp is put on the product, it goes out the door. Because if you go out and talk to what we call the friendly press, the people that you can talk to off the record, the people that you can talk to about where you're headed with the product, those people will say, oh, you're full of shit. Even if they're wrong, you're never going to go far because the review is going to say you're full of shit. So you have to know that those are the last voice of reason to come back to a business with. And it sometimes is too late, and sometimes people pull the trigger. I will also say that sometimes it's the exact opposite problem. On the digital picture frame, best reviews you ever got, but again, the only caveat was nobody could buy it. There was no way to actually buy the product. So to me, the Hail Mary is always to go get that early press that's usually the longer lead press that can tell you before you go in. Those are analysts and the longer print publications that still exist, and get those people to comment, because that's the stuff you bring back, because nobody wants to see a bad review.
Got it. Tori?
Going off of one of Tom's questions, do you have any other questions that you ask in interviews that you always ask?
Yeah, so I ask anybody who wants to be a consumer product manager or who wants to develop consumer products, what's their favorite consumer product and why? And it's really interesting when you talk about the products that you love if you're a product manager. Because I've always believed if you're a product person, you look at everything like a product person. I used to stand in the Starbucks line and think when they introduced hot sandwiches, why did you make them like so they look wilted in the case? And you know, you think of products like the Neverlost. I don't like that. I don't like the way the Neverlost works. So when you talk about a product you love, what's your passion? And that's the thing you want to hear in a new employee. It's what are you passionate about? And so a consumer product you love, how you talk about it and show your passion is usually the most important question I ask.
Anything else?
Yeah, so why did you go into this industry in particular?
Well, my early career was in the film industry, and I wanted to actually be a creative person, and then I realized I didn't have any creative talent myself. What my talent actually was in orchestrating other people to do something that people would pay for, that people would understand, and that creatively would gel in a way that the consumer would pay for it. And that's actually what technology product development is. It's very much like motion picture product development. It's something that Tom and I talk about frequently, which is how do you bring something to market that on a piece of paper in a screenplay could look different by 5 different directors or 5 different directors of photography or 10 different actors in it, right? How do you pick the right selection? How do you get that right commercialization of that package? And how do you message that to the market and make it available to them? Exactly what technology product development is to me.
All right, we're going to go out on that note. Like to thank Leslie Grandy
I have one gift. I have a gift.
Oh, sorry. Do we have any computer science engineers in the room?
Okay, so the first person who claims this, I have received a new Intel Galileo board with an Arduino processor on it and a software development kit. So if any of you are makers and want to make mobile application, there you go. She seemed to be the most enthused, so I needed an enthusiast, somebody who knows what to do with it.
All right, thank you, Leslie.
I would say ideas are good. It's okay to have ideas. Execution is the thing that makes the biggest difference.